There is no longer any doubt about the rise of domestic white supremacist groups. Experts say this movement has a global reach with a strong following right across North America. Dr. Sophie Bjork-James is assistant professor of the practice in anthropology at Vanderbilt University. She is a researcher, author, and an expert on both the US-based religious right and the white nationalist movement. We're so glad that you could take some time to join us today.
I'm very happy to be here.
What has motivated this movement throughout history?
I think it's really important to understand the current situation and the comments by the president by placing them within a broader historical context. And so what we see is that on the one hand, the United States is the world's oldest democracy. But that promise of democracy and democratic participation was originally only offered to a small percentage of the actual population of the country, based on, various forms of privileges, race, class, gender. And so what has happened is, as social movements has worked to broaden that promise, to bring in more people into participation in those democratic ideals, there's always been an organized resistance. So, we have with the abolition of the institution of slavery, right, that immediately after that is an armed, organized white resistance. The KKK forms with the explicit goal of reinstituting white power, white supremacy, using extrajudicial violence, and had an effect in securing policy then that did reestablish racial inequality. So we end up with the Jim Crow era, that lasted for decades, and, impositions on voting rights, which also lasted for decades. And so throughout history, you can see this relationship between extensions of rights and organized white opposition. So what Carol Anderson describes as white rage. And I think what, the comment made by Trump, a lot of the coverage has been saying, he failed to denounce white supremacist and paramilitary far-right groups. He didn't fail to denounce them. He encouraged them. If you look at the actual statement he made, it was, stand back, stand by, but something to the effect of oh, here it is. So the actual statement was, Proud Boys, stand back and stand by, but I'll tell you what, somebody's got to do something about Antifa and the left, right? That's not just a failure to denounce these movements. That's actually telling them to listen to his call and, to basically play the role of the police in impacting these groups.
Well, everyone is talking about the statement, stand back or stand by. Who are the Proud Boys, and what did this statement actually achieve?
So the Proud Boys are one of a number of groups that have been founded over the last decade that are primarily men. The Proud Boys are only for men. They describe themselves as Western chauvinists. So they say that anybody can be a member no matter what their race is, as long as they identify as a man. I think they can best be described as a male supremacist organization that's adjacent to white nationalism. A lot of members have, espoused white nationalist ideas. They organize events with white nationalists. The Jason Kessler, who organized the Unite the White Right rally, was a Proud Boy. So they're very much adjacent to white nationalism, even though they resolutely say that they are not actually white nationalists. But I think what's important about that is that the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, QAnon, all of these different movements, or for QAnon conspiracies, really what they are doing also is kind of being a lever for allowing white nationalist ideas into bigger communities. Because none of these groups define themselves as white supremacists, but white supremacist ideas are infused throughout their ideologies, and white supremacist activists are actually very much using each of those groups to achieve a bigger audience.
Has the pandemic actually contributed to a rise in these far-right groups?
That's hard to say. I mean, the United States has so many far-right activists and hate groups. And, when Obama was elected, there was a huge spike in both activity and membership of hate groups. I think what we've seen this year is the kind of blurring of the line between conspiracy theories, militaristic groups, and white supremacist groups. So I've studied online white nationalist groups for over a decade. And, really when I first started studying them before 2010, they were, these kind of disparate groups, that were really trying to organize online and creating online communities, but you kind of had to be a member to really spend much time in them. And so they wanted to recruit new people, and they in some ways were successful, but, they were still pretty marginalized. So social media really brought the megaphone to them, right? They created the platforms, that kind of function as like a large town square where anything goes. And, white nationalists really took social media. They saw it from the very beginning as what it could be, which was a way for them to drastically expand their reach. And so that's been happening over the last 10 years. It's really been escalating over the past 5 years. But one of their main strategies for expanding their reach is to disguise their ideas. So they know that for most white Americans are not going to want to describe themselves as racist or white supremacist. It's a stigmatized, for good reason, it's become a stigmatized identity or category. And so what they've worked on is, first was saying, well, we're not white supremacists, we're white nationalists. And then, people like Richard Spencer bringing it a step further and being like, oh, well, we're just part of the alt-right. We're part of the right, just, one far, like the far right, right? The alt-right, which for that was really bringing neo-Nazi ideas into a more palatable descriptor. And it's been a very successful strategy over time. But what I think we've seen over the last year, and especially with these different movements, the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, QAnon, is with more people are spending time online. More people are separated from, their church communities, their broader communities. And what we've seen is a proliferation of far-right groups on Facebook, on Twitter, et cetera, that are, really funneling white nationalist ideas to bigger audiences.
So have fringe groups like these historically operated around elections and presidential candidates?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, for sure there have been, but I think a lot of us are very surprised about Trump's comments, because there's no more dog whistle. For a long time there'd be kind of more indirect kind of attempts at calling or at indirect attempts at generating racist views or racist mobilizations. But this is actually part of a strategy of encouraging his supporters to become involved in both the election, but also in, street protests and trying to play a role in countering like street protests by Black Lives Matter or Antifa. And so I think this feels new. This feels very new to me.
Well, as these groups move toward the mainstream, you mentioned Antifa. Do we have to be concerned about far left extremist groups? Fears are certainly being stoked about Antifa at this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the data is really clear in terms of security experts say the biggest domestic security threat facing the United States comes from the far right. Most of the deaths that have occurred due to terrorist activity in the United States over the past decades have come from far-right activists, from white supremacist activists, going back to the Oklahoma City bombing. So there's really been, over the Southern Poverty Law Center has tracked, over 100 murders to this one particular white supremacist website. So I know that there's a lot of talk about Antifa, and Antifa's been, part of a number of organizations that have been mobilizing street protests that have led to some rioting and burning. But in terms of actual threats to individual safety, the intelligence community is very clear what the threats come from. And, Islamist extremists are one of those threats, but by far the largest threat, the intelligence community, which is about as unbiased a source as one could get, is from the far right. And so I think it's telling that we're hearing far more about threats by Antifa and the left when it's really the far right that poses the largest threat.
Well, if these trends are having a negative impact on politics today, on cultural conversations today, is it possible to correct them?
It's such a challenging question, because what needs to happen is there should be a united front, from the intelligence community about, encouraging, law-abiding citizens to not go and try to attempt to play the role of paramilitary, activities. But that isn't happening. What we see instead is a stoking of these fears, and, which a lot of them are really false, so I think what needs to happen is there should be a coordinated front, and there should be, from the highest levels of government, disavowal of racism, a disavowal of far-right extremism, a disavowal of paramilitary activity used to either disrupt peaceful protests or elections. And yet we're really seeing the opposite. One, I think, really troubling trend that also needs to be added to this is that a survey that Larry Bartels, a political scientist here at Vanderbilt, completed earlier this year, showed that increasingly those who identify as white Republicans are embracing more anti-democratic and authoritarian ideals, particularly in relationship to what he calls ethnic antagonism or racism or racial discrimination. So what this shows is that increasing numbers of conservative white Americans are believing that violence is actually going to be necessary or acceptable in terms of defending their way of life. It goes without saying, but particularly, the demographic projections are that within the next 20 to 22 years, whites will become a minority in this country. And what I think Bartel's survey shows is that is seen as a huge threat to many white Americans. So we are desperately needing, leaders to be, sharing the ideas and really demonstrating that a multiracial democracy is the ideal. It's the best thing. It's the best outcome. We are a multiracial society. We need to live up to our ideals. And that is, sharing power is going to be, is helpful. That's our future, and that there's diversity, with that diversity is our strength. But instead we're getting the opposite. We're having, unfortunately, a president that is instead stoking those fears. And I feel like if that continues, then there is going to be more violence. And the intelligence community is really clear about that.
Well, there is a lot to unpack here. It is clear that these fringe groups are increasingly infiltrating the mainstream of North American political and cultural discussion. We thank you so much for taking some time today, Dr. Bjork-James, to share your expertise with Newspoint.
Okay, thank you.